10 minutes ago, Europe's strongest alliance just fractured, and no one saw it coming. It began with a silence so deliberate, so carefully constructed that those present would later struggle to describe it without lowering their voices, as if even recalling the moment risked triggering something irreversible again. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now enjoy the video. Inside a secured conference room in Brussels, behind reinforced glass and layers of protocol designed to prevent exactly this kind of rupture, a decision was acknowledged rather than made, confirmed rather than debated. Owned and understood in an instant to be far more consequential than any treaty or summit declaration issued in the past decade. Because what unfolded in that room did not look like collapse in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits, no visible fracture lines. Instead, there was a quiet recognition passing between leaders that something foundational had already shifted beyond their control, and that the system they had spent years defending was no longer operating under the assumptions that had once made it stable. The message that triggered this realization did not arrive through the usual channels of diplomacy, nor did it carry the ceremonial weight of official communication that might have softened its implications. It appeared instead as a classified memo and distributed simultaneously to a select group of defence and economic officials across multiple European capitals, its language stripped of political cushioning and reduced to a level of technical precision that made its meaning impossible to misinterpret. It stated in terms so direct they bordered on clinical that coordinated commitments under a shared strategic framework were being suspended with immediate effect, and that all subsequent cooperation would be subject to unilateral reassessment at the national level. There was no accompanying justification, no attempt to contextualise the decision within a broader narrative, and most strikingly, no indication that this was a temporary measure. It read like a conclusion, not a proposal. Right, and that distinction is what sent the first wave of unease through those who understood its implications. At first, disbelief acted as a buffer, with several officials privately suggesting that the message must have been the result of a sophisticated cyber intrusion or a miscommunication at the highest level, because the alternative, that such a decision had been made deliberately and communicated without coordination, was too destabilising to accept in the opening minutes. Verification processes were initiated immediately, drawing on secure intelligence networks, diplomatic back channels, and direct communication between allied offices. And within a remarkably short window of time, the worst possible interpretation was confirmed as the correct one. The message was authentic, its origin undeniable, and its implications already in motion before anyone outside a tightly controlled circle had even become aware that a shift had occurred. What followed was not immediate chaos, but something more controlled and in many ways more alarming. A synchronised attempt by multiple governments to understand the scope of a decision they had not collectively made, yet were now collectively bound to respond to. Calls were placed between Berlin and Paris, between Rome and Warsaw, between institutions that had operated for decades under the assumption of alignment, now forced into rapid reassessment without a shared script to guide them. Each conversation revealed the same unsettling truth, which was that no single capital possessed the full picture, and that whatever process had led to this moment had unfolded in parallel rather than in partnership, and leaving even the most senior figures reacting rather than directing. As the first hours passed, the effects began to extend beyond the political sphere and into the economic systems that had long depended on the predictability of coordinated European action. Financial markets responded not with panic, but with recalibration, adjusting valuations in real time to reflect a landscape that had suddenly become more fragmented and less certain. Defence-related industries saw immediate volatility, while bond markets in several countries experienced subtle but significant shifts that indicated a reassessment of long-term stability. Analysts appearing on major networks, including the BBC, and panels hosted by institutions such as the Guardian's economic forums, might describe the situation using language that carefully avoided alarmism, while still conveying the magnitude of what was unfolding, emphasising that the absence of overt crisis signals did not equate to the absence of structural change. Leaked information began to surface as the day progressed, offering glimpses into a closed-door meeting that had taken place less than 48 hours earlier, during which a document had reportedly been introduced that reframed existing commitments in a way that several participants found unacceptable. According to fragments of transcripts that circulated among journalists and policy experts, the discussion had reached a point where the underlying assumptions of shared responsibility were openly questioned, and where at least one influential voice argued that the current model was no longer sustainable under evolving geopolitical pressures. The most widely quoted line from those leaks, repeated across social media and picked up by commentators from Oxford University's political analysis programmes, captured the shift in tone with stark clarity. We cannot continue to operate as if the burden is evenly shared when the realities suggest otherwise. Public reaction, once the story broke into mainstream awareness, unfolded with remarkable speed, driven by a combination of uncertainty and the human instinct to seek clarity in moments of ambiguity. Social media platforms became saturated with speculation, interpretations, and competing narratives. While protest groups in several cities began organising demonstrations that reflected a mix of frustration, concern, and a demand for transparency. Governments, aware of the potential for missteps in communication, responded cautiously, issuing statements that acknowledged the situation without fully explaining it, a strategy that in many cases only intensified public curiosity and scepticism. Within political circles, the mood evolved from confusion to a more introspective form of concern, as leaders began to consider not only the immediate implications of the decision, but also what it revealed about the underlying cohesion of the system itself. For years, unity had been presented as both a principle and a practical necessity, reinforced through treaties, joint initiatives, and shared rhetoric that emphasised collective strength. Now, and that unity appeared less like a fixed reality and more like a contingent arrangement, dependent on conditions that could change more quickly than previously assumed. This realisation introduced a level of strategic uncertainty that extended beyond any single policy area, touching on defence, economics, and the broader question of how European identity was defined in a rapidly shifting global context. The resignation that followed added another layer of complexity, not because of the individual involved, but because of the timing and the language used to explain the decision. Announced in the early hours of the morning, the departure of a senior figure closely associated with coordination efforts was framed as a response to irreconcilable strategic differences. A phrase that, while deliberately vague, may have suggested a depth of disagreement that went beyond routine policy disputes. Observers noted that the resignation did not appear to be the result of external pressure or scandal, but rather a reflection of internal dynamics that had reached a breaking point, raising further questions about the stability of existing structures. International reactions, while measured, provided additional context for interpreting the situation, as allied nations issued statements that emphasised the importance of stability and cooperation, while other global actors adopted a more reserved stance, choosing to observe rather than engage publicly. This divergence in responses highlighted the broader significance of the moment, and indicating that what was happening within Europe was being closely monitored as a potential indicator of future shifts in the global balance of power. As emergency discussions continued behind closed doors in Brussels, the atmosphere was described by those with knowledge of the proceedings as markedly different from previous crises, characterised less by urgency and more by a sense that decisions were being made within a framework that had already changed in fundamental ways. The usual signals of unity, joint appearances, coordinated messaging, symbolic gestures, were notably absent, replaced by a more cautious approach that reflected the complexity of the situation and the absence of a clear path forward. A final piece of information circulating among analysts and attributed to a classified assessment, and introduced a timeline that brought the abstract nature of the crisis into sharper focus, suggesting that if current trends continued, the structural cohesion of the system could degrade beyond recovery within a period measured not in years, but in months. The specific figure mentioned, 90 days, resonated widely because it transformed a conceptual concern into a tangible horizon, one that could be tracked, analysed, and potentially reached. This is where the story stands now, balanced between uncertainty and consequence, with multiple possible outcomes still in play and no definitive resolution in sight. The questions that emerge from this moment are not limited to immediate policy decisions, but extend to the deeper assumptions that have shaped European cooperation for generations. And challenging leaders and citizens alike to reconsider what unity means in a context where it can no longer be taken for granted. So the real issue is no longer whether a fracture has occurred, but how it will evolve, whether it can be managed, and what it reveals about the resilience of systems that were once considered unshakable. Because if such a shift can happen without warning, without a single defining event to mark its beginning, then it raises a series of unsettling possibilities about what else might already be changing beneath the surface, beyond the reach of public awareness. And as you consider that, there are 3 questions that remain impossible to ignore. If coordination can dissolve this quietly, what other agreements exist only on the assumption that they will hold? If leaders are reacting rather than directing? And who is truly shaping the outcome? And if this is only the beginning, how far will the consequences extend before they become impossible to contain? Stay alert, stay informed and subscribe, because the next development in this unfolding story may not arrive with a warning. It may simply appear already in motion, already reshaping the world before anyone has the chance to respond.